Chapter 1 of Search the Sky by Frederick Pohl and C. M. Kornbluth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Search the Sky by Frederick Pohl and C. M. Kornbluth. Chapter 1. Decay. Ross stood on the trader's ramp, overlooking the yards, and the word kept bobbing to the top of his mind. Decay. About all of Halsey's planet, there was the imperceptible reek of decay. The clean, big, bustling, efficient spaceport only made the sensation stronger. From where he stood on the height of the ramp, he could see the yards, the spires of Halsey City 10 kilometers away, and the tumble-down gray areas of Ghost Town between. Ross wrinkled his nose. He wasn't a man given to brooding, but the scent of decay had saturated his nostrils that morning. He had tossed and turned all the night, wrestling with a decision. And he had got up early, so early that the only thing that made sense was to walk to work. And that meant walking through Ghost Town. He hadn't done that in a long time, not since childhood. Ghost Town was a wonderful place to play. Tag, Follow My Fuhrer, Senators and President, all the ancient games took on new life when you could dodge and turn among crumbling ruins, dart down unmarked lanes, gallop through sagging shacks where you might stir out a screeching unexpected recluse. But it was clear that, in the 15 years between childhood games and a troubled man's walk to work, Ghost Town had grown. Everybody knew that. Ask the right specialist and they'd tell you how much and how fast. An acre a year, a street a month, a block a week, the specialist would twinkle at you, convinced that the acre, street, block was under control since they could measure it. Ask the right specialist and they would tell you why it was happening. One answer per specialist with an ironclad guarantee that there would be no overlapping of replies. A purely psychological phenomenon, Mr. Ross. A vibration of the pendulum toward greater municipal compactness. A huddling, a mature recognition of the facts of interdependence. Basically, a step forward. A purely biological phenomenon, Mr. Ross. Falling birth rate due to biochemical deficiency of trace elements processed out of our planetary diet. Fortunately, the situation has been recognized in time, and my bill before the chamber will provide a purely theological problem, Mr. Ross. Maintenance of a sprawling city is inevitably less efficient than that of a compact unit. Inevitably, there has been a drift back to the central areas and the convenience of air-conditioned walkways, winterized plazas. Yes, it was a purely psychological, biological, technological, educational, demographic problem, and it was basically a step forward. Ross wondered how many ghost towns lay corpse-like on the surface of Halsey's planet. Decay, he thought. Decay. But it had nothing to do with his problem, the problem that had kept him awake all the night, the problem that blighted the view before him now. The trading bell clanged, the day's work began. For Ross, it might be his last day's work at the yards. He walked slowly from the ramp to the offices of the Oldham Trading Corporation. "Morning, Ross, boy," his breezy young boss greeted him. Charles Oldham IV's father had always taken a paternal attitude toward his help, and Charles Oldham IV was not going to change anything that Daddy had done. He shook Ross's hand at the door of the suite and apologized because they hadn't been able to find a new secretary for him yet. They'd been looking for 2 weeks, but the 3 applicants they had been able to dredge up had all been hopeless. "It's the damn chamber," said Charles Oldham IV, winsomely gesturing with his hands to show how helpless men of affairs were against the blundering interference of government. "Damn labor shortage is nothing but a damn artificial scarcity crisis. Daddy saw it. He knew it was coming." Ross almost told him he was quitting, but held back. Maybe it was because he didn't want to spoil Oldham's day with bad news right on top of the opening bell. Or maybe it was because, in spite of a sleepless night, he still wasn't quite sure. The morning's work helped him to become sure. It was the same monotonous grind. 3 freighters had arrived at dawn from Halsey's third moon, but none of them was any affair of his. There was an export shipment of jewelry and watches to be attended to, but the ship was not to take off for another week. It's scarcely classified as urgent. Ross worked on the manifests for a couple of hours, stared through his window for an hour, and then it was time for lunch. Little Marconi hailed him as he passed through the trader's lounge. Of all the juniors on the exchange, Marconi was the one Ross found easiest to take. He was lean and dark, where Ross was solid and fair. Worse, he stood 4 ranks above Ross in seniority. But since Ross worked for Oldham and Marconi worked for Harlan's, the difference could be waived in social intercourse. Ross suspected that to Marconi as to him, trading was only a job, a dull one and not a crusade. And he knew that Marconi's reading was not confined to bills of lading. "Lunch?" asked Marconi. "Sure," Ross said. And he knew he'd probably spill his secret to the little man from Harlan's. The Sky Room was crowded, comparatively. All 8 of the usual tables were taken. They pushed on into the roped-off area of the windows and found a table overlooking the yards. Marconi blew dust off his chair. "Been a long time since this was used," he grumbled. "Drink?" He raised his eyebrows when Ross nodded. It made a break. Marconi was the one usually who had a drink with lunch. Ross never touched it. When the drinks came, each of them said to the other in perfect synchronism, "I've got something to tell you." They looked startled, then laughed. "Go ahead," said Ross. The little man didn't even argue. Rapturously, he drew a photo out of his pocket. God, thought Ross wearily, Lurleen again. He studied the picture with a show of interest. "New snap?" he asked brightly. "Lovely girl." Then he noticed the inscription. "To my fiancé with crates of love." "Well," he said, "fiancé, is it? Congratulations, Marconi." Marconi was almost drooling on the photo. "Next month," he said happily, "a big, big wedding. For keeps, Ross, for keeps, with children." Ross made an expression of polite surprise. "You don't say," he said. "It's all down in black and white. She agrees to have 2 children in the first 5 years. No permissive clause, a straight guarantee. 1,500 annual allowance per child. And Ross, do you know what? Her lawyer told her right in front of me that she ought to ask for 3,000, and she told him, 'No, Mr. Turek, I happen to be in love.'" "How do you like that, Ross?" "A girl in a million," Ross said feebly. His private thoughts were that Marconi had been gaffed and netted like a sugar perch. Lurleen was of the old landowners, who didn't own anything much but land these days. And Marconi was an undersized nobody who happened to make a very good living. Sure, she happened to be in love. Smartest thing she could be. Of course, promising to have children sounded pretty special, but the papers were full of those things these days. Marconi could reliably be counted on to hang himself. He'd promise her breakfast in bed every third weekend, or the maid that he couldn't possibly find on the labor market, and the courts would throw all the promises on both sides out of the contract as a matter of simple equity. But the marriage would stick all right. Marconi had himself a final, moist, fatuous sigh and returned the photo to his pocket. "And now," he said brightly, craning his neck for the waiter, "what's your news?" Ross sipped his drink, staring out at the nuzzling freighters in their hemispherical slips. He said abruptly, "I might be on one of those next week. Fallon's got a purser's berth open." Marconi forgot the waiter and gaped. "Quitting?" "I've got to do something," Ross exploded. His own voice scared him. There was a knife blade of hysteria in the sound of it. He gripped the edge of the table and forced himself to be calm and deliberate. Marconi said tardily, "Easy, Ross." "Easy? You said it, Marconi. Easy. Everything's so damned easy and so damned boring that I'm just about ready to blow. I've got to do something," he repeated. "I'm getting nowhere. I push papers around and then I push them back again. You know what happens next. You get soft and paunchy. You find yourself going by the book instead of by your head. You're covered if you go by the book, no matter what happens. And you might just as well be dead." "Now, Ross—" "Now, hell," Ross flared. "Marconi, I swear, I think there's something wrong with me. Look, take Ghost Town, for instance. Ever wonder why nobody lives there except a couple of crazy old hermits?" "Why, it's Ghost Town," Marconi explained. "It's deserted." "And why is it deserted? What happened to the people who used to live there?" Marconi shook his head. "You need a vacation, son," he said sympathetically. "That was a long time ago, hundreds of years, maybe." "But where did the people go?" Ross persisted desperately. "All of the city was inhabited hundreds of years ago. The city was twice as big as it is now. How come?" Marconi shrugged. "Don't know." Ross collapsed. "Don't know. You don't know. I don't know. Nobody knows. Only thing is, I care. I'm curious. Marconi, I get, well, moody, depressed. I get to wondering about crazy things. Ghost Town, for one. And why can't they find a secretary for me? Am I really different from everybody else, or do I just think so? Doesn't that mean that I'm insane?" He laughed. Marconi said warmly, "Ross, you aren't the only one. Don't ever think you are. I went through it myself. Found the answer, too. You wait, Ross." He paused. Ross said suspiciously, "Yeah?" Marconi tapped the breast pocket with the photo of Lurline. "She'll come along," he said. Ross managed not to sneer in his face. "No," he said wearily. "Look, I don't advertise it, but I was married once. I was 18, it lasted for a year, and I'm the one who walked out. Flat fee settlement. It took me 5 years to pay off the loan, but I never regretted it." Marconi began gravely. "Sexual incompatibility—" Ross cut him off with an impatient gesture. "In that department," he said, "it so happens she was a genius. But—" "But?" Ross shrugged. "I must have been crazy," he said shortly. "I keep thinking that she was half dead, dying on the vine like the rest of Halsey's planet. And I must still be crazy, because I still think so." The little man involuntarily felt his breast pocket. He said gently, "Maybe you've been working too hard." "Too hard?" Ross laughed, a curious blend of true humor and self-disgust. "Well," he admitted, "I need a change anyhow. I might as well be on a longliner. At least I'd have my spree to look back on." No, Marconi said so violently that Ross slopped the drink he was lifting to his mouth. Ross looked hard at the little man, hard and speculatively. No, then, he said, it was just a figure of speech, of course. But tell me something, won't you, Marconi? Tell you what? Tell me why such a violent reaction to the word longliner. I want to know. Hell, Ross, the little man grumbled. You know what a longliner is. Gutter scrapings for a crew. Nothing for a man like you. I want to know more, Ross insisted. When I ask you what a longliner is, what the crew do with themselves for 2 or 3 centuries, you change the subject. You always change the subject. Maybe you know something I don't know. I want to know what it is. And this time, the subject doesn't get changed. You don't get off the hook until I find out. He took a sip of his drink and leaned back. Tell me about longliners, he said. I've never seen one coming in. It's been 15 years or so since that bucket from Sirius 4, hasn't it? But you were on the job then. Marconi was no longer a man in love or one of the few people whom Ross considered to be wholly alive like him. He was a hard-eyed little stranger with a stubborn mouth and an ingratiating veneer. In short, he was again a traitor, and a good one. I'll tell you anything I know, Marconi declared positively and insincerely. Attend to that fellow first, though, will you? He pointed to a uniformed Yards messenger whose eyes had just alighted on Ross. The man threaded his way, stumbling, through the tables, and laid a sealed envelope down in the puddle left by Ross's drink. Sorry, sir, he said crisply, wiped off the envelope with his handkerchief, and, for lagniappe, wiped the puddle off the table into Ross's lap. Speechless, Ross signed for the envelope on a red-tabbed slip marked Urgent, Priority, Rush. The messenger saluted, almost putting his own eye out, and left, crashing into tables and chairs. Half dead, Ross muttered, following him with his eyes. How the devil do they stay alive at all? Marconi said, unsmiling, You're taking this kick pretty seriously, Ross. I admit he's a little clumsy, but nothing, said Ross. Don't try to tell me you don't know something's wrong, Marconi. He's a bumbling incompetent, and half his generation is just like him. He looked bitterly at the envelope and dropped it on the table again. More manifests, he said. I swear I'll start throwing tableware if I have to check another bill of lading. Brighten my day, Marconi. Tell me about the longliners. You're not off the hook yet, you know. Marconi signaled for another drink. All right, he said. Marconi tells all about longliners. They're ships. They go from the planet of one star to the planet of another star. It takes a long time because stars are many light years apart, and rocket ships cannot travel as fast as light. Einstein said so, whoever he was. Do we start with the Sirius 4 ship? I was around when it came in, all right. 15 years ago, and Halsey's planet is still enjoying the benefits of it. And so is Leverett and Sons Trading Corporation. They did fine on flowers from seeds that bucket brought. They did fine on sugar perch from eggs that bucket brought. I've never had it myself. Raw fish for dessert. But some people swear by it. At 5 shields a portion. They can have it. The hook, Marconi? Ross reminded grimly. Trader Marconi laughed amiably. Sorry. Well, what else? Pictures and music. But I'm not much on them. I do read, though, and as a reader I say, God bless that bucket from Sirius 4. We never had a novelist like Morris Halliday on this planet, or an essayist like J. Waring. Let's see, there have been 8 Halliday novels off the microfilm so far, and I think Leverett still has a couple in the vaults. Leverett must be... Marconi, I don't want to hear about Leverett and Sons, or Morris Halliday, or Waring. I want to hear about longliners. I'm trying to tell you, Marconi said sullenly, the mask down. No, you're not. You're telling me that the long-line ships go from one stellar system to another with merchandise. I know that. Then what do you want? Don't be difficult, Marconi. I want to know the facts. All about longliners, the big hush-hush. The candid explanations that explain nothing except that a starship is a starship. I know that they're closed-system, multi-generation jobs. A group of people get in on Sirius 4, and their great-great-great-great-grandchildren come giggling and stumbling out on Halsey's planet. I know that every couple of generations your firm, and mine for that matter, builds one with profits that would be taxed off anyway, and slings it out, stocked with seeds and film and sound tape and patent designs and manufacturing specifications for every new gimmick on the market, in the hope that it'll be back long after we're dead with a similar cargo to enrich your firms and my firms, then current owners. Sounds silly, but as I say, it's tax money anyhow. I know that your firm and mine staff the ships with half a dozen bums of each sex, who are loaded aboard with a dandy case of delirium tremens, contracted from spending their bounty money the only way they know how. And that's just about all I know. Take it from there, Marconi, and be specific. The little man shrugged irritably. That gag's beginning to wear thin, Ross, he complained. What do you want me to tell you? The number of welds in Bulkhead 47 of Starship 74? What's the difference? As you said, a starship is a starship. It's a longliner. Without them, the inhabited solar systems would have no means of contact or commerce. What else is there to say? Ross looked suddenly lost. I don't know, he said. Don't you know, Marconi? Marconi hesitated, and for a moment Ross was sure he did know. Knew something, at any rate. Something that might be an answer to the doubts and nagging inconsistencies that were bothering him. But then Marconi shrugged and looked at his watch and ordered another drink. But there was something wrong. Ross felt himself in the position of a diagnostician whose patient willfully refuses to tell where it hurts. The planet was sick, but wouldn't admit it. Sick? Dying? Maybe he was on the wrong track entirely. Maybe the starships had nothing to do with it. Maybe there was nothing that Marconi knew that would fit a piece into the puzzle and make the answer come out all clear. But Ghost Town continued to grow acre by acre, year by year, and Oldham still hadn't found himself a secretary capable of writing her own name. According to the historians, everything fits nicely into place, Ross said dubiously. They say we came here ourselves in longliners once, Marconi. Our ancestors, under some man named Halsey, colonized this place 1,400 years ago. According to the longliners that came in from other stars, their ancestors colonized wherever they came from in starships from a place called Earth. Where is this Earth, Marconi? Marconi said succinctly, Look in the star charts, it's there. Yes, but hell, Marconi said in annoyance. What in the world has got into you, Ross? Earth is a planet like any other planet. The starship Halsey colonized in was a starship like any other starship, only bigger. I guess, that is, I wasn't there. After all, what are the longliners but colonists? They happen to be going to planets that are already inhabited, that's all. So a starship is nothing new or even very interesting. And this is beginning to bore me, and you ought to read your urgent priority rush message. Ross felt repentant, knowing that that was just how Trader Marconi wanted him to feel. He said slowly, I'm sorry if I've been a nuisance, Marconi. You know how it is when you feel stale and restless. I know all the stories, but it's so damned hard to believe them. The famous colonizing ships, they must have been absolutely gigantic to take any reasonable number of people on a closed-circuit, multi-generation ride. We can't build them that big now. No reason to. But we couldn't if we had to. Imagine shooting those things all over the galaxy. How many inhabited planets in the charts? 500? 1,000? Think of the technology, Marconi. What became of it? We don't need that sort of technology anymore, Marconi explained. That job is done. Now we concentrate on more important things. Learning to live with each other, developing our own planet, increasing our understanding of social factors and demographic. Ross was laughing at last. Well, Marconi, he said at last, that takes care of that. We sure have figured out how to handle the social factors all right. Every year there are fewer of them to handle. Pretty soon we'll all be dead, and then the problem can be marked solved. Marconi laughed too, eagerly, as if he'd been waiting for the chance. He said, "Now that that's settled, are you going to open your message? Are you at least going to have some lunch?" The yard's messenger stumbled up to their table again, this time with an envelope for Marconi. He looked sharply at Ross's unopened envelope and said nothing pointedly. Ross guiltily picked it up and tore it open. You could act like a sulky child in front of a friend, but strangers didn't understand. The message was from his office. Radar reports high-velocity spacecraft on auto controls. First approximation trajectory indicates interstellar origin. Probable ETA yards 1,500. No radio messages received. Don't have to tell you to get on this immediately and give it your best. Oldham. Ross looked at Marconi, whose expression was perturbed. Bet I know what your message says, he offered with an uneasy quaver in his voice. Marconi said, I'll bet you do. Oldham's radar setup on Sunward always has been better than Harlan's. Better location. Man, you are in trouble. Let's get out of here and hope nobody's missed you so far. They grabbed sandwiches from the snack bar on the way out and munched them while the yard's jeep took them to the ready line. Skirting the freighters in their pits, slipping past the enormous overhaul sheds, they saw excited debates going on. Twice they were passed by yard's vehicles heading toward the landing area. Halfway to the line, they heard the recall sirens warning everybody and everything out of the 10 seared acres surrounded by homing and ground-controlled approach radars. That was where the big ones were landed. The ready line was jammed when they got there. Ships from one or another of the 5 moons that circled Halsey's planet were common. The moons were the mines. Even the weekly liner and freighters from the colony on Sunward, the planet next in from Halsey's, were routine to the yard's workers. But to anybody, an interstellar ship was a sensation, a once or twice in a lifetime thrill. Protocols were uncertain. Traders argued about the first crack at the strangers and their goods. A dealer named Alborg said the only fair system would be to give every trader there an equal opportunity to do business, in alphabetical order. Everybody agreed that under no circumstances should the man from Leverett and Sons be allowed to trade. Everybody except the man from Leverett and Sons. He pointed out that his firm was the logical choice because it had more and fresher experience in handling interstellar goods than any other. They almost mobbed him. It wasn't merely money that filled the atmosphere with electric tingles. The glamour of time travel was on them. The crew aboard that ship were travelers of time as well as space. The crew that had launched the ship was dust. The crew that served it now had never seen a planet. There was even some humility in the crowd. There were thoughtful ones among them who reflected that it was not, after all, a very great feat to hitch a rocket to a shell and lob it across a few million miles to a neighboring planet. It was eclipsed by the tremendous deed whose climax they were about to witness. The thoughtful ones shrugged and sighed as they thought that even the starship booming down toward Halsey's planet, fitted with the cleverest air replenishers and the most miraculously efficient waste converters, was only a counter in the game whose great rule was the mass energy formulation of the legendary Einstein. That there is no way to push a material object past the speed of light. A report swept the field that left men reeling in its wake. Radar track confirmed that the ship was of unfamiliar pattern. All hoped that it might be a starship launched from this very spot on the last leg of a stupefying round trip was officially dead. The starship was foreign. "Wonder what they have," Marconi muttered. "Traitor," Ross sneered ponderously. He was feeling better. The weight of depression had been lifted for the time being, either by his confession or the electric atmosphere. If every day were like this, he thought vaguely. "Let's not kid each other," Marconi was saying exuberantly. "This is an event, man. Where are they from? What are they peddling? Do I get a good cut at their wares? It could be 50,000 shields for me in commission alone. Lorleen and I could build a tower house on Great Blue Lake with that kind of money, with a whole floor for her parents. Ross, you just don't know what it is to be really in love. Everything changes." A jeep roared up and slammed to a stop. Ross blinked and yelled, "Here it comes!" They watched the ground-controlled approach with the interest of semi-professionals and concealed their rising excitement with shop talk. "Whoops! There goes the high-power job into action." Marconi pointed as a huge dish antenna swiveled ponderously on its mast. "Seems the medium-output dishes can't handle her." "Maybe the high-powered dish can't either. She might be just plain shot." "Standard sealed GCA doesn't get shot, my young friend. Not in a neon atmosphere tank it doesn't. Maybe along about the 5th generation they forgot what it was and cut it open with an acetylene torch to see what was inside." "Bad luck for us in that case, Ross." The ship steadied on a due west course and flashed across the heavens and over the horizon. Someone decided a braking ellipse or two was in order. "What about line of sight?" "No sweat. The GCA jockey, and I'd bet it's Delafield himself, pushes a button that hooks him into the high-powered dish at every rocket field on Halsey's. It's been all thought out. There's a potential fortune aboard that longliner, and Field's administration wants its percentage for servicing and accommodating." "Wonder what they have." "I already asked that one, Ross." "So you did." They lapsed into silence until the rocket boomed in again from the east, high and slow. The big dish swiveled abruptly and began tracking again. "He'll try to bring her down this time." "Yes! There go 4 and stabilizing jets." Flame jutted from the silvery speck high in the blue. Its apparent speed slowed to a crawl. It vanished for a second as steering jets turned her slowly endwise. They caught the sight of the stern jets when they blasted for the descent. It was uneventful, just the landing of a very, very big rocket. When a landing is successful, it is like every other successful landing ever made. But the action that the field whirled into immediately following the landing was far from routine. The bullhorns roared that all traders, wipers, rubbernecks, and visitors were to get ready behind the ready lines and stay there. All Class 3 and higher field personnel were to take stations for long-liner clearance. The weapons and decontamination parties were to take their stations immediately. Captain Delafield would issue all future orders, and don't let any of the traders talk you out of it, men. Captain Delafield would issue all future orders. Ross watched in considerable surprise as fieldmen working with drill precision broke out half a dozen sleek, needle-nosed guns from an innocent-looking bay of the warehouse and manhandled them into position. From another bay, a large pressure tank was hauled and backed against the lock of the starship. Ross could see the station medic bustlingly supervise that, and the hosing of white gunk onto the juncture between tank and ship. Delafield crossed the stretch from the GCA complex to the tank, vanished into it through a pressure-fitted door, and that was that. The tank had no windows. Ross said to Marconi wonderingly, "What's all this about? There was Doc Gibbons handling the pressure tank. There was Chuck Blaney rolling out a goddamn cannon I never knew was there. How many more little secrets are there that I don't know about?" Marconi grinned. "They have gun drill once a month, my young friend, and they never say a word about it. Let the right rabble-rouser get hold of the story, and he might sail into office on a platform of 'Keep the bug-eyed monsters off Halsey's planet.' You have to have reasonable precautions, military and medical, though, and this is the straight goods. There's never been any trouble of either variety." The conversation died, and there was a long, boring hour of nothing. At last, Delafield appeared again. One of the decontamination party ran up in a jeep with a microphone. "What'll it be?" Ross demanded. "Alphabetic order, or just a rush?" The announcement floored him. "Representative of the Harland Trading Corporation, please report to the decontamination tank." The representative of the Harland Trading Corporation was Marconi. "Hell," Ross said bitterly. "Good luck with them, whoever they are." Marconi brooded for a moment and then said gruffly, "Come on along." "You mean it?" "Sure. Naturally, Ross, you'll give me your word not to make any commercial offers or inquiries without my permission?" "Oh, naturally." They started across the field and were checked through the ready line, Marconi cheerfully presenting his identification and vouching for Ross. Captain Delafield at the tank snapped, "What are you doing here, Ross? You're Oldham's man. I distinctly said—" "My responsibility, Captain. Will that do it?" Marconi asked. Delafield snapped, "It'll be your fundament if Harlan hears about it. Actually, it's the damnedest situation. They asked for Harlan's." Marconi looked frightened, and his hand involuntarily went to his breast pocket. He swallowed and asked, "Where are they from?" Delafield grimaced and said, "Home." Marconi exploded. "Oh, no! That's all I can get out of them. I suppose their trajectory can be analyzed, and there must be books. We haven't been in the ship yet. Nobody goes in until it gets sprayed, rayed, dusted, and busted down into its component parts. Too many places for nasty little mutant bacteria and viruses to lurk." "Sure, Captain. Home, eh? They're pretty simple. Happy little morons, 15 of them, ranging in age from 1 month to what looks like 120. All they know is home, and 'We wish to see the representative of the Harlan Trading Corporation.' First the old woman said it, then the next in line, he must have been about 100, said it, then a pair of identical twins, 50-year-old women, said it in chorus. The rest of them, on down to the month-old baby, and I swear to God he tried to say it. Well, you're the Harlan Trading Corporation. Go on in." End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Search the Sky by Frederick Pohl and C. M. Kornbluth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. They were all naked. Why not? There's no weather in a spaceship. All of them laughed when Ross and Marconi came in through the lock, except the baby, who was nursing at the breast of a handsome woman. Their laughter was what attracted Ross immediately. Cheerful, no meanness in it. The happy yelping of puppies at play with a red rubber bone. A stab went through him as the pleasure in their simple happiness turned to recollection and recognition. His wife of a decade ago. Ross studied them with amazement, expecting to find her features in their features, her figure in theirs, and failed. Yet they reminded him inescapably of his miserable year with that half a woman. But they were physically no kin of hers. They were just cheerful laughers who he knew were less than human. The cheerful laughers exposed unblemished teeth in all their mouths, including that of the 120-year-old matriarch. Why not? If you put calcium and fluorides into a closed system, they stay there. The old woman stopped laughing at them long enough to say to Marconi, "We wish to see the representative of the Harland—" "Yes, I know. I'm the representative of the Harland Trading Corporation. Welcome to Halsey's Planet. May I ask what your name is, ma'am?" "Ma," she said genially. "Pleased to meet you, Ma. My name's Marconi." Ma said, bewildered, "You just said you were the representative of the Harland Trading—" "Yes, Ma, but that's all right. Let's say that's my other name. Two names. Understand?" She laughed at the idea of two names, wonderingly. Marconi pressed, "And what's the name of this gentleman?" "He isn't gentleman. He's Sonny." Sonny was 100 years old. "Pleased to meet you, Sonny. And your name, sir?" "Sonny," said a red-headed man of 80 or thereabouts. The identical twin women were named the Kids. The baby was named Him. The rest of the troop were named Girl, Ma, or Sonny. After introductions, Ross noticed that Him had been passed to another Ma who was placidly suckling him. She had milk. It dribbled from the corner of the baby's mouth. "There isn't another baby left in the ship, is there?" Ross asked in alarm. They laughed, and the Ma suckling the baby said, "There was, but she died. Mostly they do when you put them into the box after they get born. Ma here was lucky. Her Him didn't die." "Put them in the box? What box? Why?" Marconi was nudging him fiercely in the ribs. He ignored it. They laughed amiably at his ignorance and explained that the box was the box, and that you put your newborn babies into it because you put your newborn babies into it. A beep tone sounded from the ship. Ma said, "We have to go back now. The representative of the Harland Trading Corporation, Marconi." "What for?" Ma said, "At regular intervals, signaled by a tone of 600 cycles, and an intermediate downward shifting of the ship lights from standard illumination frequency to a signal frequency of 420 millimicrons, ship's operating personnel take positions at the control boards for recalibration of ship working meters and instruments against the battery of standard masters. We'll be right back." They trooped through the hatch, leaving Ross and Marconi staring at each other in the decontamination tank. "Well," Ross said slowly, "at last I know why the longliner departments have their little secrets. The box. I say it's murder." "Be reasonable," Marconi told him, but his own face was white under the gleaming germicidal lamps. "You can't let them increase without limit, or they'd all die. And before they die, there'd be cannibalism. Which do you prefer?" Letting kids be born and then snuffing them out if a computer decides they're the wrong sex or over the quota is inhuman. I didn't say I like it, Ross, but it works. So do pills. Pills are a private matter. A person might privately decide not to take hers. The box is a public matter, and the group outnumbers and overrules a mother who decides not to use it. There's your question of effectiveness answered, but there's another point. The people are sane, Ross. Preposterously naive, but sane. Saner than childless women or sour old bachelors we both know who never had to love anything small and helpless, and so came to love nobody but themselves. They're sane. Partly because the women get a periodic biochemical shakeup called pregnancy that their biochemical balance is designed to mesh with. Partly because the men find tenderness and protectiveness in themselves toward the pregnant women. Mostly, I think, because it's something to do. Can you imagine the awful monotony of life in the ship? The work is sheer rote and repetition. They can't read or watch screen tapes. They were born in the ship, and the books and screen tapes are meaningless because they know nothing to compare them with. The only change they see is each other aging toward death. Frequent pregnancies are a godsend to them. They compare and discuss them. They wonder who the fathers are. They make bets of rations. The men brag and keep score. The girls look forward to their first and their last. The jokes they make up about them, the way they speculate about twins, the purgative fear even keeps them sane. And then, Ross said, the box. Staring straight ahead at the ship's port, Marconi echoed, "Yes, the box. If there were another way, but there isn't." His breezy young boss, Charles Oldham IV, was not pleased with what Ross had to report. "Asked for Harland?" he repeated unbelievingly. "Those dummies didn't know where they were going or where they were from, but they knew enough to ask for Harland?" He slammed his ruler on his desk and yelled, "God damn it!" "Mr. Oldham," Ross protested, aghast. For a superior to lose his temper publicly was unthinkable. It covered you with embarrassment. "Manners be goddamned too," Oldham screamed, breaking up fast. "What do you know about the state of our books? What do you know about the overhead I inherited from my loving father? What the hell do you know about the down curve in sales?" "These fluctuations," Ross began soothingly. "Fluctuations be goddamned. I know a fluctuation when I see one, and I know a long-term downtrend when I see one. And that's where we're riding, right into bankruptcy, fellow. And now these goddamned dummies blow in from nowhere with a consignment exclusively for Harland. I don't know why I don't get to hell out of this stupid business and go live in a shack on Great Blue Lake and let the planet go ahead and rot." Ross's horror at the unseemly outburst was eclipsed by his interest at noting how similarly he and Oldham had been thinking. "Sir," he ventured, "I've had something on my mind for a while." "It can wait," Oldham growled, collecting himself with a visible effort. So there went his chance to resign. "What about customs? I know Harlan hasn't got enough cash to lay out. Who has?" Ross said glibly, "Usual arrangements, sir. They turn an estimated 25% of the cargo over to the Port Authority for auction, the receipts to be in full discharge of their import tax. And I suppose they enter protective bids. They aren't wasting any time. Auction's 2100 tonight." "You handle it," Oldham muttered. "Don't go over 100,000 shields. Diversify the purchases as much as possible, and try to sneak some advance information out of the dummies if you get a chance." "Yes, sir," Ross said. As he left, he saw Oldham taking a plastic bottle from a wall cabinet. And that, thought Ross as he rode to the Freeport, was the first crack he had ever seen in the determined optimism of the trading firm's top level. They were optimists and they were idealists, at least to hear them tell it. Interplanetary trading was a cause and a mission. The traders kept the flame of commerce alight. Perhaps, thought Ross, they had been able to indulge in the hypocrisy of idealism only so long as a population upcurve assured them of an expanding market. Perhaps now that births were flattening out, some said the dirty word declining, they all would drop their optimistic creed in favor of fang and claw competition for the favors of the dwindling pool of consumers. And that, Ross thought gloomily, was the way he'd go himself if he stayed on, junior trader to senior trader to master trader, growing every year more paranoidally suspicious of his peers, less scrupulous in the chase of the shield. But he was getting out, of course. The purser's berth awaited, and then perhaps the awful depressions he had been enduring would lift off him. He thought of the master traders he knew. His own man, Oldham, none too happy in the hereditary business. Leverett, still smug and fat with his terrific windfall of the Sirius 4 starship 15 years ago. Marconi's boss, Harland. Harland broke the sequence all to hell. It just wasn't possible to think of Harland being driven by avarice and fear. He was the oldest of them all, but there was more zest and drive in his parchment body than in the rest of them combined. In the auction hall, Ross found a seat near the velvet ropes. One of the professional bidders, lounging against a wall, flicked him an almost imperceptible signal, and he answered with another. That was that. He had his man, and a good one. They had often worked together in the commodity pits, but not so often or so exclusively that the bidder would be instantly known as his. Inside the enclosure, Marconi, seated at a bare table, labored over a sheaf of papers with one of the Sonnies from the ship. Sonny was wriggling in coveralls, the first clothes he had ever worn. Ross saw they hadn't been able to get shoes onto him. Who else did he know? Captain Delafield was sitting soberly within the enclosure. Win Fraley, the hottest auctioneer on the port, was studying a list, his lips moving. Every trading firm was represented. The heads of the smaller firms were there in person, not daring to delegate the bidding job. Plenty of port personnel, just there for the excitement of the first longliner in 15 years, even though it was well after close of the business day. The goods were in sealed cases against the back wall as usual. Ross could only tell that some of them were perforated and therefore ought to contain living animals. Only the one Sonny from the starship crew was there. Presumably the rest were back on the ship. He wouldn't be able to follow Oldham's orders to snoop out the nature of the freight from them. Well, damn Oldham, damn even the auction, Ross thought to himself. His mood of gloom did not lift. The auction was kind of a letdown. All that turmoil and bustle, concentrated in a tiny arc around the velvet ropes, contrasted unpleasantly with the long vacant rows of dusty seats that stretched to the back of the hall. Maybe a couple of centuries ago Ross would have enjoyed the auction more, but now all it made him think of was the thing he had been brooding about for a night and a day. The slow emptying of the planet. The decay. But as usual, no one else seemed to notice or to care. Captain Delafield consulted his watch and stood up. He rapped the table. In accordance with the rules of the Trade Commission and the appropriate governing statutes, he droned, certain merchandise will now be placed on public auction. The Harlan Trading Corporation, consignee, agrees and consents to divest itself of merchandise from consignment 97-W, amounting by estimate of the customs authorities to 25% of the total value of all merchandise in said consignment. All receipts of this auction are to be entered as excise duties paid by the consignee on said merchandise, said receipts to constitute payment in full on excise on consignment 97-W. The clerk will record. If any person here present wishes to enter an objection, let him do so. Thank you. He glanced at a slip of paper in his hand. I am requested to inform you that the Harland Trading Corporation has entered with the clerk a protective bid of 5,000 shields on each item. There was a rustle in the hall. 5,000 shields was a lot of money. Your auctioneer, Win Fraley, said Captain Delafield, and sat down in the first row of seats. The auctioneer took a long, slow swallow of water, his eyes gleaming above the glass at the audience. Theatrically, he tossed the glass to an assistant, smacked his hands together, and grinned. Well, he boomed genially, I don't have to tell you, gentlemen, that somebody's going to get rich tonight. Who knows? Maybe it'll be you. But you can't make money without spending money. So without further ado, let's get started. I have here, he rapped out briskly, item number 1. Now, you don't know, and I don't know exactly what item number 1 contains. But I can tell you this. They wouldn't have sent it 231 light years if they didn't think it was worth something. Let's get this started with a rush, folks, and I mean with a big bid to get in the right mood. After all, the more you spend here, the less you have to pay in taxes. He laughed. You ready? Here's the dope. Item number 1. His assistant slapped a carton at the extreme left of the line. Weight 215 grams net, 15 cubic centimeters, 1 microfilm reel included. Reminds me, he reminisced, of an item just about that size on the Sirius 4 shipment. Turned out to be Mary Jane seeds, and I don't suppose I have to tell anybody here how much Mr. Leverett made out of Mary Janes. I bet every one of us has been smoking them ever since. What do you say, Mr. Leverett? You did all right last time. Want to say 10,000 as a first bid on item number 1? 9,000? Do I hear? One of the smaller traders, not working through a professional bidder, not even decently delegating the work to a junior, bid 7,500 shields. Like the spokesman for the other big traders, Ross sat on his hands during the early stages. Let the small fry give themselves a thrill and drop out. The big firms knew to a fraction of a shield how much the small ones could afford to bid on a blind purchase, and the easiest way to handle them was to let them spend their budgets in a hurry. Of course, the small traders knew all this, and their strategy, when they could manage it, was to hold back as long as possible. It was a matter of sensing emotion rather than counting costs, of recognizing the fraction of a second in which a little fellow made up his mind to acquire an item and bidding him up, of knowing when he'd gone his limit and letting him have it at a ruinous price. It was an art, and Ross, despising it, knew that he did it very, very well. He yawned and pretended to read a magazine while the first 6 items went on the block. The little traders seemed desperate enough to force the price up without help. He bid on item 7, partly to squeeze a runt trader and partly to test his liaison with his professional bidder. It was perfect. The pro caught his signal, a bored inspection of his fingernails, while seeming to peek clumsily at the man from Leverett's. Ross let the next 2 pass, and then acquired 3 items in rapid succession. The fever had spread to most of the bidders by then. They were starting at 10,000 and up. One or two of the early birds had spent their budgets and were leaving looking sandbagged, as indeed they had been. Ross signaled Take 5 to his professional and strolled out for a cup of coffee. On the way back, he stopped for a moment outside the hall to look at the stars and breathe. There were the familiar constellations: the Plowman, the Rocket Fleet, Marilyn Monroe. He stood smoking a cigarette and yearning toward them until somebody moved in the darkness near him. "Nice night, Ross," the man said gloomily. It was Captain Delafield. "Oh, hello, sir," Ross said, the world descending around him again like a too substantial curtain. "Taking a breather?" "Had to," the captain growled. 10 more minutes in that place and I would have thrown. Damned money-grabbing traitors. No offense, Ross. Just that I don't see how you stand the life. Seems to have gotten worse in my time. Much worse. You high rollers goading the peewees into shooting their wads. It didn't used to be like that. Gallantry. Not stomping a downed man. I don't see how you stand it." "I can't stand it," Ross said quietly. "Captain Delafield, you don't know. I'm so sick to death of the life I'm leading and the work that I'm doing, I'd do anything to get away. Mr. Fallon offered me a purser spot on his ship. I've been thinking about it very seriously." "Purser? A dirty job. There's nothing to do except when you're in port, and then there's so much to do that you never get to see the planet. I don't recommend it, Ross." Ross grunted, thinking. If even the purser's berth was no way out, what was left for him? 60 more years of waiting for a starship and scheming how to make a profit from its contents? 60 more years watching Ghost Town grow by nibbles on Halsey City, watching the traders wax in savagery as they battle for the ever-diminishing pool of consumers? Watching obscene comedies like Lurleen of the Old Landowners graciously condescending to wed Marconi of the New Nobodies? He said wearily, "Then what shall I do, Captain? Rot here with the rest of the planet?" Delafield shrugged, surprisingly gentle. "You feel it too, Ross? I'm glad to hear it. I'm not sensitive, thank God, but I know they talk about me. They say I quit the space-going fleet as soon as I had a chance to grab off the port captaincy. They're right, I did, because I was frightened." "Frightened? You?" Delafield's ribbons for a dozen heroic rescues gleamed in the light that escaped from the hall. "Sure, Ross." He flicked the ribbons. "Each one of these means I and my men pulled some people out of a jam they got into because of somebody's damn stupidity or slow reflexes or defective memory. No, I withdraw that. The Thetis got stove in because of mechanical failure, but all the rest were human error. There got to be too many for me. I want to enjoy my old age. Ready to face that if you become a purser? I can tell you that if you don't like it here, you won't be happy on Sunward and you won't like the moons. And you most especially and particularly won't like being a purser. It's the same job you're doing now, but it pays less, offers you a 6x8 cubicle to work and live in, and gives you nothing resembling a future to aim at. Now, if you'll excuse me, I better get back inside. I've enjoyed our talk." Ross followed the captain gloomily. Nothing had changed inside. Ross lounged in the doorway, inconspicuously picking up the eye of his bidder. Marconi was gone from the enclosure. Ross looked around hopefully and found his friend in agitated conversation with an unrecognizable but also agitated man at the back of the hall. Ross drifted over. Heads were turning in the front rows. As Ross got within range, he heard a couple of phrases. "In the ship. Mr. Harlan especially asked for you. Please, Mr. Marconi." "Oh, hell," Marconi said disgustedly. "Go on. Tell him I'll be there. But how he expects me to take care of things here, and... He trailed off as he caught sight of Ross. Trouble? Ross asked. Not exactly. The hell with it. Marconi stared indecisively at the auctioneer for a moment. He said obscurely, Taking your life isn't enough. He wants more. And I thought I'd be able to see Lurleen tonight. Excuse me, Ross. I've got to get over to the ship. He hurried out. Ross looked wonderingly after him, caught the eye of his bidder, and went back to work. By the time the auction was over and dawn was breaking in the west, Oldham Trading had bought 9 lots of merchandise, 3 breathing, 5 flowering, and 1 roll of microfilm. Ross took his prizes to the office, where Charles Oldham was waiting, much the better for a few drinks and a long nap. How much? Demanded Oldham. Evidently they were both supposed to ignore his hysteria of the night before. 57,000, Ross said dully. For 9 lots. Good man. With any kind of luck at all. And Oldham babbled on and on. He wanted Ross to stay and view the microfilm projection, stand by for a report from a zoologist and a botanist on the living acquisitions. He pleaded weariness, and Oldham became conciliatory to the wonderful young up-and-comer who had bid in the merchandise at a whopping bargain price. Ross dragged himself from the building into a cab and home. Morosely undressing, he lit a cigarette and brooded. Well, that was it. What you'd been waiting for since you were a junior apprentice. The starship came, you had the alien prizes in your hands, and you realized they were as tawdry as the cheap gimcracks you export every week to Sunward. He stared out the window, over Ghost Town, to the field. The sun was high over the surrounding mountains. He imagined he could pick out the reflected glimmer from the starship a dozen miles away. Marconi at least got to examine the ship. Marconi might be there now. He'd been headed that way when Ross saw him last, and evidently not enjoying it much. Ross wondered vaguely if anybody really enjoyed anything. He stubbed out his cigarette. As he fell asleep, he was remembering what Delafield had told him about the moons and the planet ports. His dreams were of the cities of other planets, and every one of them was populated by aloof Delafields and avaricious Oldhams. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 2 of Search the Sky by Frederick Pohl and C.M. Kornbluth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. Wake up, Ross, Marconi was saying, joggling him. Come on, wake up. Ross thrust himself up on an elbow and opened his eyes. He said, with a tongue the size of his forearm in a dust-lined mouth, What time is it? What the hell are you doing here, for that matter? It's around noon. You slept for 3 hours. You can get up. Oh. Ross automatically reached for a cigarette. The smoke got in his eyes and he rubbed them. It dehydrated and seared what little healthy tissue appeared to be left in his mouth, but it woke him up a little. What are you doing here? He demanded. Marconi's hand was involuntarily on his breast pocket again, the one in which he carried Lurleen's picture. He said harshly, You want a job? Topside? Better than purser? He wasn't meeting Ross's eye. His gaze roved round the apartment and lighted on a coffee maker. He filled it and snapped it on. Get dressed, will you? He demanded. Ross sat up. What's this all about, Marconi? What do you want, anyway? Marconi, for his own reasons, became violently angry. You're the damnedest question-asker I ever did meet, Ross. I'm trying to do you a favor. What favor? Ross asked suspiciously. You'll find out. You've been belly aching to me long enough about how dull your poor little life is. Well, I'm offering you a chance to do something big and different. And what do, you crawfish? Are you interested or aren't you? I told you, it's a space job and a big one. Bigger than being a purser for Fallon. Bigger than you can imagine. Ross began to struggle into his clothes, no more than half comprehending, but stimulated by the magic words. He asked, puzzling sleepily over what Marconi had said, "What are you sore about?" His guess was that Lurline had broken a date, but it seemed to be the wrong time of day for that. "Nothing," Marconi said grumpily. "Only I have my own life to live." He poured 2 cups of coffee. He wouldn't answer questions while they sipped the scalding stuff, but somehow Ross was not surprised when, downstairs, Marconi headed his car along the winding road through Ghost Town that led to the yards. Every muscle of Ross's body was stiff and creaky. Another 6 hours of sleep would have been a wonderful thing. But as they drove through the rutted streets of Ghost Town, he began to feel alive again. He stared out the window at the flashing ruins, piecing together the things Marconi had said. "Watch it!" he yelled, and Marconi swerved the car around a tumbled wall. Ross was shaking, but Marconi only drove faster. This was crazy. You didn't race through Ghost Town as though you were on the pleasure parkways around the Great Blue Lake. It wasn't safe. The buildings had to fall over from time to time. Nobody certainly bothered to keep them in repair, and nobody bothered to pick up the pieces when they fell either, until the infrequent road-mending teams made their rounds. But at last they were out of Ghost Town, on the broad highway from Halsey City to the port. The administration building and car park was just ahead. It was there that Marconi spoke again. "I'm assuming, Ross, that you weren't snowing me when you said you wanted thrills, chills, and change galore? That's not the way I put it, but I wasn't snowing you. You'll get them. Come on." He led Ross across the field to the longliner, past a gaggle of laughing, chattering Sonnies and Maws. He ignored them. The longliner was a giant of a ship, a blunt torpedo 100 meters tall. It had no ports, naturally enough. The designers of the ship certainly didn't find any reason for its idiot crew to look out into space, and landings and takeoffs would be remote controlled. 200 years old it was, but its metal was as bright, its edges as sharp as the newest of the moon freighters at the other end of the hard stand. 200 years, a long trip, but an almost unimaginably long distance that trip covered. For the star that spawned it was undoubtedly almost as far away as light would travel in 2 centuries' time. At 186,000 miles per second, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, Ross's imagination gave up the task. It was far. He stared about him in fascination as they entered the ship. He gaped at sterile, gray-walled cubicles, each of which contained the same chair and cot. No screen or projector for longliners. Ross remembered his rash words of the day before about shipping out on a longliner, and shuddered. "Here we are," said Marconi, stopping before a closed door. He knocked and entered. It was a cubicle like the others, but there were reels stacked on the floor and a projector. Sitting on the cot, in a just-awakened attitude, was Old Man Harland himself. Beady-eyed, Ross thought, watchful. Harlan asked, "Ross?" "Yes, sir," Marconi said. There was tension in his voice and attitude. "Do you want me to stay, sir?" Harlan growled, Good God, no. You can get out. Sit down, Ross. Ross sat down. Marconi, carefully looking neither to right or left, went out and closed the door. Harlan stretched, scratched, and yawned. He said, "Ross, Marconi tells me you're quite a fellow. Sincere, competent, a good man to give a tough job to. Namely, his." "Junior fourth trader?" Ross asked, bewildered. "A little more dramatic than that, but we'll come to the details in a minute. I'm told you were ready to quit Oldham for a purser's berth. That's ethical. Would you consider it unethical to quit Oldham for Harland?" "Yes, I think I would." "Glad to hear it. What if the work had absolutely nothing to do with trading and never brings you into a competitive situation with Oldham?" "Well," Ross scratched his jaw, "well, I think that would be all right. But a junior fourth job, Mr. Harlan." The floor bucked and surged under him. He gasped. "What was that?" "Blast off, I imagine," Harlan said calmly. "We're taking off. Better lie down." Ross flopped to the floor. It was no time to argue, not with the first stage pumps thundering and the preheaters roaring their threat of an imminent 4G thrust. It came like thunder, slapping Ross across the floor plates as though he were glued to them. He felt every tiny wrinkle in every weld he lay on, and one arm had fallen across a film reel. He heaved and succeeded in levering it off the reel. It thwacked to the floor as though sandbags were stacked meters high atop it. Blackout came very soon. He awoke in freefall. He was orbiting aimlessly about the cubicle. Harlan was strapped to the cot, absorbed in manipulating the portable projector, trying to thread a free-floating film. Ross bumped against the old man. Harlan abstractedly shoved him off. He careened from a bulkhead and flailed for a grip. "Oh," said Harlan, looking up. "Awake?" "Yes, awake," Ross said bitterly. "What is all this? Where are we?" The old man said formally, "Please forgive my cavalier treatment of you. You must not blame your friend Marconi. He had no idea that I was planning an immediate blast-off with you. I had an assignment for him which he preferred not to accept. Not to mince words, Ross, he quit." "Quit his job?" The old man shook his head. "No, Ross, quit much more than the job of working for me. He quit on an assignment which is, I am sorry if it sounds melodramatic, absolutely vital to the human race." He suddenly frowned. I think," he added weakly, "bear with me, Ross. I'll try to explain as I go along. But you see, Marconi left me in the lurch. I needed him and he failed me. He felt that you would be glad to take it on, and he told me something about you." Harlan glowered at Ross and said with a touch of bitterness, "A recommendation from Marconi at this particular point is hardly any recommendation at all. But I haven't much choice. And besides, I took the liberty of calling that pompous young fool you work for." "Mr. Harland?" Ross cried, outraged. "Oldham may not be any prize, but really—" "Oh, you know he's a fool. And he had a lot to say about you. Enough so that if you want the assignment, it's yours. As to the nature of the assignment itself—" Harland hesitated, then said briskly, "The assignment itself has to do with a message my organization received via this longliner. Yes, a message. You'll see. It has also to do with certain facts I've found in its log, which, if I can ever get this damn thing working— there we are." He had succeeded in threading the film. He snapped on the projector. On the screen appeared a densely packed block of numerals, rolling up and being replaced by new lines as fast as the eye could take them in. Harlan said, "Notice anything?" Ross swallowed. "If that stuff is supposed to mean anything to me," he declared, "it doesn't." Harlan frowned. "But Marconi said—" Well, never mind. He snapped off the projector. "That was the ship's log, Ross. It doesn't matter if you can't read it. You wouldn't, I suppose, have had much call for that sort of thing working for Oldham. It's a mathematical description of the routine of this ship, from the time it was space-launched until it arrived here yesterday. It took a long time, Ross. The reason that it took a long time is partly that it came from far, far away. But even more, there is another reason. We were not this ship's destination, not the original destination. We weren't even the first alternate, or the second alternate. To be exact, Ross, we were the seventh choice for this ship." Ross let go of his stanchion, floated a yard, and flailed back to it. "That's ridiculous, Mr. Harland," he protested. "Besides, what has all this to do with—" "Bear with an old man," said Harland, with an amused gleam in his eye. There was very little he could do but bear with him, Ross thought sourly. "Go on," he said. Harland said professorially, "It is conceivable, of course, that a planet might be asleep at the switch. We could believe it, I suppose, if it seemed that the first-choice planet somehow didn't pick the ship up when this long liner came into radar range. In that event, of course, it would orbit once or twice on automatics, and then select for its first alternate target, which it did. It might be human failure in the GCA station once." He nodded earnestly. "Once, Ross, not 6 times. No planet passes up a trading ship." "Mr. Harland," Ross exploded, "it seems to me that you're contradicting yourself all over the place. Did 6 planets pass this ship up, or didn't 6 planets pass this ship up? Which is it? And why would anybody pass a longliner up anyhow?" Harlan asked, "Suppose the planets were vacant." "What?" Ross was shaken. "But that's silly. I mean, even I know that the star charts show which planets are inhabited and which aren't. And suppose the star charts are wrong? Suppose the planets have become vacant. The people have died off, perhaps, their culture decayed." Decay, death, and decay. Ross was silent for a long time. He took a deep breath. He said at last, "Sorry, I won't interrupt again." Harlan's expression was a weft of triumph and relief. 6 planets passed this ship up. Remember Leverett's ship 15 years ago? 3 planets passed that one before it came to us. 9 different planets, all listed on the traditional star charts as inhabited, civilized, equipped with GCA radars and everything else needed. 9 planets out of communication, Ross. Decay, thought Ross. Aloud he said, "Tell me why." Harland shook his head. "No," he said strongly, "I want you to tell me. I'll tell you what I can. I'll tell you the message that this ship brought to me. I'll tell you all I know, all I've told Marconi that he isn't man enough to use, and the things that Marconi will never learn as well. But why 9 planets that used to be pretty much like our own planet are now out of communication, that you'll have to tell me." Forward rockets boomed. The braking blasts hurled Ross against the forward bulkhead. Harland rummaged under the cot for spacesuits. He flung one at Ross. "Put it on," he ordered. "Come to the airlock. I'll show you what you can use to find out the answers." He slid into the pressure suit, dived weightless down the corridor, Ross zooming after. They stood in the airlock, helmets sealed. Wordlessly, Harland opened the petcocks, heaved on the locked door. He gestured with an arm. Floating alongside them was a ship like none Ross had ever seen before. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Search the Sky by Frederick Pohl and C.M. Kornbluth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. Picture Leif's longboat bobbing in the swells outside Ambrose Light, while the 20th century liners steam past, a tiny, ancient thing, related to the new giants only as the Eohippus resembles the horse. The ship that Harland revealed was fully as great a contrast. Ross knew spaceships as well as any grounder could, both the lumbering interplanetary freighters and the titanic longliners. But the ship that swung around Halsey's planet was a midget. Fueled rocket ships must be huge. Its jets were absurdly tiny, clearly incapable of blasting away from planetary gravity. Its entire hull length was unbroken and sheer. Did the pilot dare fly blind? The coupling connections were being rigged between the ships. "Come aboard," said Harland, spryly wriggling through the passage. Ross, swallowing his astonishment, followed. The ship was tiny indeed. When Ross and Harland, clutching handholds, were drifting weightlessly in its central control cabin, they very nearly filled it. There was one other cabin, Ross saw, and the two compartments accounted for a good 9/10 of the cubage of the ship. Where that left space for the combustion chambers and the fuel tanks, the crew quarters and the cargo holds, Ross could not imagine. He said, "All right, Mr. Harland. Talk." Harland grinned toothily, his expression eerie in the flickering violet light that issued from a gutter around the cabin's wall. "This is a spaceship, Ross. It's a pretty old one, 1,400 years, give or take a little. It's not much to look at compared with the up-to-date models you're used to, but it's got a few features that you won't find on the new ones. For one thing, Ross, it doesn't use rockets." He hesitated. "Ask me what it does use," he admitted, "and I can't tell you. I know the name because I read it. Nucleophoretic drive. What nucleophoresis is and how it works, I can't say. They call it the Wesley effect, and the tech manual says something about squared miles of acceleration. Does that mean anything to you?" "No, how could it? But it works, Ross. It works well enough so that this little ship will get you where you're going very quickly. The stars, Ross. It will take you to the stars. Faster than light. What the top speed is, I have no idea. But there's a ship's log here, too, and it has a 3-month entry. 3 months, Ross, in which this little ship explored the solar systems of 14 stars." Wide-eyed, Ross held motionless. Harland paused. 1,400 years, he repeated. 1,400 years this ship has been floating out here, and for all that time, the longliners have been crawling from star to star, while little hidden ships like this one could have carried 1,000 times as much good 1,000,000 times faster. Maybe the time has come to get the ships out of hiding. I don't know. I want to find out. I want you to find out for me. I'll be specific, Ross. I need a pilot. I'm too old, and Marconi turned it down. Someone has to go out there. He gestured at the blind hull and the unseen stars beyond, and find out why 9 planets are out of communication. Will you do it? Ross opened his mouth to speak, and 1,000 questions competed for utterance, but what he said, barely aloud, was only, yes. The far-off stars, more than 1,000 million of them in our galaxy alone. By far the greatest number of them drifted alone through space, or with only a stellar companion as utterly unlivable by reason of heat and crushing gravity as themselves. Fewer than 1 in a million had a family of planets, and most even of those could never become a home for human life. But out of 1,000 million, any fraction may be a very large number, and the number of habitable planets was in the hundreds. Ross had seen the master charts of the inhabited universe often enough to recognize the names as Harland mentioned them. Tau Centauri II, Earth, the 8 inhabitable worlds of Capella, but to realize that this ship, had touched down on each of them, and on 100 more, was beyond astonishment. It was a dream thing, impossible, but unquestioned. Through Harlan's burning old eyes, Ross looked back through 14 centuries, to the time when this ship was a scout vessel for a colonizing colossus. The lumbering giant drove slowly through space on its one-way trip from the planet that built it. Was it semi-mythical Earth? The records were not clear. While the tiny scout probed each star and solar system as it drew within range, while the mothership was covering a few 100 million miles, the scout might flash across parsecs to scan half a dozen worlds. And when the scout came back with word of a planet where humans could survive, they christened it with the name of the scout's pilot. And the chart room labored, and the ship's officers gave orders, and the giant's nose swerved through a half-degree and began its long, slow deceleration. "Why slow?" Ross demanded. "Why not use the faster-than-light drive for the big ships?" Harlan grimaced. "I've got to answer that one for you sooner or later," he said. "But let me make it later. Anyway, that's what this ship was. A faster-than-light scout ship for a real longliner. What happened to the longliner, the records don't show. My guess is the colonists cannibalized it to get a start in constructing homes for themselves. But the scout ship was exempted. The captain of the expedition had it put in an orbit out here and left alone. It's been used a little bit, now and then. My great-grandfather's father went clear to 40 Eridani when my great-grandfather was a little boy. But by and large, it has been left alone. It had to be, Ross. For one thing, it's dangerous to the man who pilots it. For another, it's dangerous to the galaxy." Harlan's view was anthropomorphic. The danger was not to the immense and uncaring galaxy, but to the sparse fester of life that called itself humanity. When the race abandoned Earth, it was a gesture of revulsion. Behind them, they left a planet that had decimated itself in wars. Ahead lay a cosmos that in all their searches had revealed no truly sentient life. Earth was a crippled world, the victim of its playing with nuclear fission and fusion. But the techniques that gave them a faster-than-light drive gave them as well a weapon that threatened solar systems, not cities, that could detonate a sun as readily as uranium could destroy a building. The child with his forbidden matches was now sitting atop a munitions dump. The danger was no longer a seared hand or a blinded eye, but annihilation. And the decision had been made: secrecy. By what condign struggles the secrecy had been enforced, the secrecy itself concealed, but it had worked. Once the radiating colonizers had reached their goals, the nucleophoretic effect had been obliterated from their records, and, except for a single man on each planet, from their minds. Why the single man? Why not bury it entirely? Harlan said slowly, "There was always the chance that something would go wrong, you see, and it has." Ross said hesitantly, "You mean the 9 planets that have gone out of communication?" Harlan nodded. He hesitated. "Do you understand it now?" he asked. Ross shook his head dizzily. "I'm trying," he said. "This little ship, it travels faster than light. It has been circling out here, how long? 1,400 years? And you kept it secret? You and your ancestors before you, because you were afraid it might be used in war?" He was frowning. "Not afraid it would be used," Harlan corrected gently. "We knew it would be used." Ross grimaced. "Well, why tell me about it now? Do you expect me to keep it a secret all the rest of my life?" "I think you would," Harlan said soberly. "But suppose I didn't? Suppose I blabbed all over the galaxy and it was used in war?" Harlan's face was suddenly, queerly gray. He said, almost to himself, "It seems that there are things worse than war." Abruptly he smiled. "Let's find Ma." They returned through the coupling and searched the longliner for the old woman. A Sonny told them, "Ma usually hangs around the meter room, likes to see them blinking." And there they found her. "Hello, Harlan," she smiled, flashing her superb teeth. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "Perfect, Ma. I want to talk to you under the seal." She looked at Ross. "Him?" she asked. "I vouch for him," Harlan said gravely. "Wesley," she answered. "The limiting velocity is c." "But c squared is not a velocity," Harlan said. He turned to Ross. "Sorry to make a mystery," he apologized. "It's a recognition formula. It identifies one member of what we call the Wesley families, or its messenger to another. And these people are messengers. They were dispatched a couple of centuries ago by a Wesley family whose ship, for some reason, no longer could be used. Why? I don't know why. Try your luck. Maybe you can figure it out. Ma, tell us the history again." She knitted her brows and began to chant slowly. "In great-grandfather's time the target was Clyde, rocketry firm and oars on the side. If we hadn't have seen them direct, we'd have missed 'em. There wasn't a blip from the whole damn system. That was the first. Before great-grandfather's day was done, we cut the orbit of Cyrnus 1. The contact there was Traitor McHugh, but the sons of bitches missed us too. That was the second. My grandpa lived to see the green of Target 3 through the high-powered screen, but where the hell was Builder Carruthers? They let us go by like all the others. That was the—" "Ma," said Harlan, "thanks very much, but would you skip to the last one?" Ma grinned. "The Harland Trading Corps was last, with the fuel down low and going fast. I'm glad it was me who saw the day when they brought us down on GCA. I told him the message, he called it a mystery, but anyway, this is the end of the history, and it's about time." "The message, please," Harlan said broodingly. Ma took a deep breath and rattled off. L sub t equals L sub 0 e to the minus t over 2n. Ross gaped. That's the message? Used to be more to it, Ma said cheerfully. That's all there is now, though. The darn thing doesn't rhyme or anything. I guess that's the most important part. Anyway, it's the hardest. It's not as bad as it seems, Harlan told Ross. I've asked around. It makes a very little sense. It does? Well, up to a point, Harlan qualified. It seems to be a formula in genetics. The notation is peculiar, but it's all explained, of course. It has something to do with gene loss. Now, maybe that means something, and maybe it doesn't. But I know something that does mean something. Some member of a Wesley family a couple of 100 years ago thought it was important enough to want to get it across to other Wesley families. Something's happening. Let's find out what it is, Ross. The old man suddenly buried his face in his hands. In a cracked voice, he mumbled, Gene loss and war. Gene loss or war. God, I wish somebody would take this right out of my hands. Or that I could drop with a heart attack this minute. You ever think of war, Ross? Shocked and embarrassed, Ross mumbled some kind of answer. One might think of war, good breeding taught, but one never talked about it. You should, the old man said hoarsely. War is what this faster-than-light secrecy and identification rigmarole is all about. Right now, war is impossible. Between solar systems, anyhow, and that's what counts. A planet might just barely manage to fit an invading multi-generation expedition at gigantic cost, but it never would. The fruits of victory, loot, political domination, maybe slaves, would never come back to the fitters of the expedition, but to their remote descendants. A firm will take a flyer on a commercial deal like that, but no nation would accept a war on any such basis. Because a conqueror is a man, and men die. With FTL, faster-than-light travel, they might invade Cernus or Azor or any of those other tempting dots on the master maps. Why not? Take the marginal population, hop them up with patriotic fervor and lust for booty, and ship them off to pillage and destroy. There's at least a 50% chance of coming out ahead on the investment, isn't there? Much more attractive deal commercially speaking than our present longliners. Ross had never seen a war. The last on Halsey's planet had been the Peninsular Rebellion about a century and a half ago. Some 500,000 constitutionally psychopathic inferiors had started themselves an ideal society with theocratic trimmings in a remote and unfruitful corner of the planet. Starved and frustrated by an unrealistic moral creed, they finally exploded to devastate their neighboring areas and were quickly quarantined by a radioactive zone. They disintegrated internally, massacred their priesthood, and were permitted to disperse. It was regarded as a shameful episode by every dweller on the planet. It wasn't a subject for popular film reels. If you wanted to find out about the Peninsular Rebellion, you went through many successive library doors and signed your name on lists, and were sternly questioned as to your age and scholarly qualifications and reasons for sniffing around such an unsavory mess. Ross had not the slightest comprehension of Harlan's anxiety. He told him so. I hope you're right, was all the old man would say. I hope you don't learn worse. The rest was work. He had the yard worker's familiarity with conventional rocketry, which saved him some study of the fine maneuvering apparatus of the FTL craft, but not much. For a week under Harlan's merciless drilling, he jetted the ship about its remote area of space, far from the commerce lines, until the old man grudgingly pronounced himself satisfied. There were skull-busting sessions with the Wesley Drive, or rather with a first derivation of it, an insane-looking object which you could vaguely describe as a fan-shaped slide rule taller than a man. There were 27 main tracks, analogs of the 27 main geodesics of Wesley space, whatever they were and whatever that was. Your cursor settings on the main tracks depended on a 32-step computation based on the apparent magnitudes of the 27 nearest celestial bodies above a certain mass, which varied according to yet another lengthy relationship. Then, having cleared the preliminaries out of the way, you began to solve for your actual setting on the FTL drive controls. Somehow he mastered it, while Harland, driving himself harder than he drove the youth who was to be his exploring eyes and ears, coached him and cursed him and, somehow, kept his own complicated affairs going back on Halsey's planet. When Ross had finally got the theory of the Wesley Drive in some kind of order in his mind, and had learned all there was to learn about the other worlds, and had cut his few important ties with Halsey's planet, he showed up in Harlan's planet-based office for a final repetitive briefing. Marconi was there. He had trouble meeting Ross's eyes, but his hand clasp was firm and his voice warmly friendly and a little envious. "The very best, Ross," he said. I wish—" He hesitated and stammered. He said in a flood, "Damn it, I should be going. Do a good job, Ross, and I hope you don't hate me." And he left while Ross, disturbed, went in to see old man Harland. Harland spared no time for sentiment. "You're cleared for spaceflight," he growled. "According to the visa, you're going to Sunward, in case anyone asks you between here and the port. Actually, let's hear where you are going." Ross said promptly, "I am going on a mission of exploration and reconnaissance. My first proposed destination is Reagan's world, second Gemser, third Azor. If I cannot make contact with any of these 3 planets, I will select planets at random from the master charts until I find some Wesley Drive families somewhere. The contacts for the first 3 planets are: on Reagan's world, Foley Associates; on Gemser, the Franklin Foundation; on Azor, Cavallo Machine Tool Company. FTL contacts on the other planets are listed in the appendix to the master charts. The coordinates for Reagan's world are—" "Skip the coordinates," mumbled Harlan, rubbing his eyes. "What do you do when you get in contact with a Wesley Drive family?" Ross hesitated and licked his lips. Well, it's a little hard." "Damn it!" roared Harland. "I've told you 1,000 times. Yes, sir, I know. All I meant was I don't exactly understand what I'm looking for." "If I knew what you were to look for," Harlan rasped, "I wouldn't have to send you out looking. Can't you get it through your thick head? Something is wrong. I don't know what. Maybe I'm crazy for bothering about it. Heaven knows I've got troubles enough right here. But we Harlans have a tradition of service, and maybe it's so old that we've kind of forgotten just what it's all about. But it's not so old that I've forgotten the family tradition. If I had a son, he'd be doing this. I counted on Marconi to be my son. Now, all I have left is you. And that's little enough, heaven knows," he finished bitterly. Ross, wounded, said by rote, "On landing, I will attempt at once to make contact with the local Wesley Drive family using the recognition codes given me. I will report to them on all the data at hand and suggest the need for action." Harland stood up. "All right," he said. "Sorry I snapped at you. Come on, I'll go up to the ship with you." And that was the way it happened. Ross found himself in the longliner, then with Harland in the tiny, ancient, faster-than-light ship which had once been tender to the ship that colonized Halsey's planet. He found himself shaking hands with a red-eyed, suddenly old Harland, watching him crawl through the coupling to the longliner, watching the longliner blast away. He found himself setting up the FTL course and throwing in the drive. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Search the Sky by Frederick Pohl and C.M. Kornbluth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. Ross was lucky. The second listed inhabited planet was still inhabited. He had not quite stopped shuddering from the first when the approach radar caught him. The first planet was given in the master charts as Reagan's World, population 900 million, diameter 9,400 meters, mean orbit 0.8 AU, and the coordinates went on to describe it as the fourth planet of a small G-type sun. There had been some changes made. The coordinates now intersected well inside a bright and turbulent gas cloud. It appeared that suppressing the FTL drive had not quite annihilated war. But the second planet, Gemser, there he was sure was a world where nothing was seriously awry. He left the ship mumbling a name to himself, Franklin Foundation, and he was greeted by a corporal's guard of dignified and ceremonially dressed men. They smiled at him, welcomed him, shook his hand, and invited him to what seemed to be the local equivalent of the administration building. He noticed disapprovingly that they didn't seem to go in for the elaborate decontamination procedures of Halsey's planet, but perhaps, he thought, they had bred disease resistance into their bloodlines. Certainly the four men in his guide party seemed hale and well preserved, though the youngest of them was not less than 60. "I would like," he said, "to be put in touch with the Franklin Foundation, please." "Come right in here," beamed one of the four, and another said, "Don't worry about a thing." They held the door for him, and he walked into a small and sybaritically furnished room. The second man said, "Just a few questions. Where are you from?" Ross said simply, "Halsey's planet," and waited. Nothing happened, except that all four men nodded comprehendingly, and the questioner made a mark on a sheet of paper. Ross amplified, 53 light-years away, another star." "Certainly," the man said briskly. Your name?" Ross told him, but with a considerable feeling of deflation. He thought wryly of his own feelings about the long lines and the far stars. He remembered the stir and community excitement that a starship meant back home. Still, Ross told himself, Halsey's planet might be just a back eddy in the main currents of civilization. Quite possibly on another world, this one for instance, travelers from the stars were a commonplace. The field hadn't seemed overly busy, though, and there was nothing resembling a spaceship, unless, he thought with a sudden sense of shock, those rusting hulks clumped together at the edge of the field had once been spaceships. But that was hardly likely, he reassured himself. You just don't let spaceships rust. "Sex?" the man asked. And age? Education? Marital status? The questions went on for more time than Ross quite understood, and they seemed far from relevant. Questions for the most part, and some of them were hard questions to answer. Tau quotient, for instance. Ross blinked and said with an edge to his voice, "I don't know what a tau quotient is." "Put him down as 0, one of the men advised, and the interlocutors nodded happily. Working with others' rating? He asked, beaming. Ross said with controlled irritation, Look, I don't know anything about these ratings. Will you take me to somebody who can put me in touch with the Franklin Foundation? The man who was sitting next to him patted him gently on the shoulder. Just answer the questions, he said comfortably. Everything will be all right. Ross flared. The hell everything will. Something with electrified spikes in it hit him on the back of the neck. Ross yelled and ducked away. The man next to him returned a little rod to his pocket. He smiled at Ross. Don't feel bad, he said sympathetically. Go ahead now, answer the questions. Ross shook his head dazedly. The pain was already leaving his neck, but he felt nauseated by the suddenness and sharpness of it. He could not remember any pain quite like that in his life. He stood up waveringly and said, Wait a minute now. This time it was the man on the other side, and the pain was about twice as sharp. Ross found himself on the floor looking up through a haze. The man on his right kept the rod in his hand, and the expression on his face, while in no way angry, was stern. Bad boy, he said tenderly. Why don't you want to answer the questions? Ross gasped. God damn it! All I want is to see somebody. Keep your dirty hands off me, you old fools. And that was a mistake, as he learned in the blessedly few minutes before he passed out completely under the little rods held by the gentle but determined men. He answered all the questions, bound to a chair with two of the men behind him when he had regained his consciousness. He answered every one. They only had to hit him twice. When they untied him the next morning, Ross had caught on to the local folkways quite well. The fatherly fellow who released him said, Follow me, and stood back, smiling, but with one hand on one of the little rods. And Ross was careful to say, Yes, sir. They rode in a three-wheeled car and entered a barracks-like building. Ross was left alone next to a bed in a dormitory with 100 beds. Just wait here, the man said, smiling. The rest of your group is out at their morning session now. When they come in for lunch, you can join them. They'll show you what to do. Ross didn't have too long to wait. He spent the time in conjecture as confused as it was fruitless. He had obviously done something wrong, but just what was it? If he had had twice as long, he would have got no further toward an answer than he was. Nowhere. But a noise outside ended his speculations. He glanced toward the curiously shaped door. All the doors on this planet seemed to be rectangular. A girl of about 18 was peering inside. She stared at Ross and said, "Oh." Then she disappeared. There were footsteps and whispers, and more heads appeared and blinked at him and were jerked back. Ross stood up in wretched apprehension. All of a sudden, he was 14 years old again, and entering a new school where the old hands were giggling and whispering about the new boy. He swore sullenly to himself. A new face appeared, halted for an inspection of Ross, and walked confidently in. The man was a good 40 years old, Ross thought. Perhaps a kind of overseer in this institution, whatever kind of institution it was. He approached Ross at a sedate pace, and he was followed through the door in single file by a couple score men and women. They ranged in age, Ross thought wonderingly, from the leader's 40 down to the late teens of the girl who had first peered in the door and was now at the end of the procession. The leader said, "How old are you?" Ross figured confusedly. This planet's annual orbital period was roughly 40% longer than his own. 14 into his age multiplied by 10, making his age in their local calculations. Why, I'm 19 of your years old, about, and a half. Yes, and what can you do? Look here, sir, I've been through all this once. Why don't you go and ask those gentlemen who brought me here? And can anybody tell me where the Franklin Foundation is? The 40-ish fellow, with a look of outrage, slapped Ross across the mouth. Ross knocked him down with a roundhouse right. A girl yelled, "Good for you, Junior!" and jumped like a wildcat onto a slim gray-haired lady, clawing and slapping. The throng dissolved immediately into a wild melee. Ross, busily fighting off the 40-ish fellow and a couple of his stocky buddies, noted that the scrap was youth against age, whatever it meant. "How dare you!" a voice thundered, and the rioters froze. A decrepit wreck was standing in the doorway, surrounded by 3 or 4 gerontological textbook cases, only a little less spavined than he. "Glory!" a girl muttered despairingly. "It would be the minister." "What is the meaning of this brawl?" rolled from the wreck's shriveled lips in a rich basso. No, rolled, Ross noted, from a flat perforated plate on his chest. There was a small, flesh-colored mic slung before his lips. "Who is responsible here?" said the golden basso. Ross's 40-ish assailant said humbly, "I am, sir. This new fellow here." "Manners. Speak when you're spoken to." Abjectly, "Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir." "Silly fools," the senile wreck hectored them. "I'm going to take no official notice of this, since I am merely passing through. Luckily for you, this is no formal inspection. But you've lost your lunch hour with your asinine pranks. Now get back to your work, and never let me hear of a disgraceful incident like this again from Junior Unit 23. He swept out with his retinue. Ross noted that some of the younger girls were crying, and that the older men and women were glaring at him murderously. "We'll teach you manners, you pup," the foreman type said. "You go on the dye vats this afternoon. Any more trouble and you'll miss a few meals." Ross told him, "Just keep your hands off me, mister." The foreman type expanded into a beam of pleasure. "I thought you'd be sensible," he said. "Everybody to the plant, now." He collared a pretty girl of about Ross's age. "Helena here is working out a bit of insolence on the dye vats herself. She'll show you." The girl stood with downcast eyes. Ross liked her face and wondered about her figure. Whatever it was like, it was covered from neck to knee by a loose shirt. But the older women wore fitted clothes. The foreman type led a grand procession through the door. Helena told Ross, "I guess you'd better get in front of me in line. I go here." She slipped in deftly, and Ross understood a little more of what went on here. The procession was in order of age. He had determined to drift for a day or two, not that he seemed to have much choice. The Franklin Foundation, supposedly having endured a good many years, would last another week while he explored the baffling mores of this place and found out how to circumvent them and find his way to the keepers of FTL on this world. Nobody would go anywhere with his own ship, not without first running up a setting for the Wesley Drive. The line filed into a factory whose like Ross had never seen before. He had a fair knowledge of and an eye for industrial processes. It was clear that the place was an electric cable works, but why was the concrete floor dangerously cracked and sloppily patched? Why was the big enameling oven grumbling and stinking? Why were the rolling mills in a far corner unsupplied with guards and big, easy-to-hit emergency cutoffs? Why was the light bad and the air full of lint? Why did the pickling tank fume and make the workers around it cough hackingly? Most pointedly of all, why did the dye vats to which Helena led him stink and slop over? There were grimy signs everywhere, including the isolated bay where braiding cord was dyed the standard code colors. The signs said things like, "Age is a privilege and not a right. Age must be earned by work. Gratitude is the index of your progress to maturity." Helena said girlishly as she took his arm and hooked him out of the moving line, "Here's Stinksville. Believe me, I'm not going to talk back again. After all, one's maturity is measured by one's acceptance of one's environment, isn't it?" "Yeah," said Ross. "Listen, Helena, have you ever heard of a place called the Franklin Foundation?" "No," she said. "First you climb up here. Golly, I don't even know your name." "Ross." "All right, Ross. First you climb up here and make sure the yarn's running over the rollers right. Sometimes it gets twisted around and then it breaks. Then you take one of the thermometers from the wall and you check the vat temperature. It says right on the thermometers what it should be for the different colors. If it's off, you turn that gas tap up or down just a little. Then you check the wringer rolls where the yarn comes out. Watch your fingers when you do. The yarn comes in different thicknesses on the same thread, so you have to adjust the wringer rolls so too much dye doesn't get squeezed out. You can tell by the color. It shouldn't be lighter after it goes through the rolls. But the yarn shouldn't come through sloppy and drip dye on the floor while it travels to the bobbin." There was more, equally uncomplicated. He took the yellow and green vats. She took the red and blue. They had worked in the choking stench and heat for perhaps 3 hours before Ross finished one temperature check and descended to adjust a gas tap. He found Helena spent and gasping on the floor, hidden from the rest of the shop by the bulky tanks. "Heat knock you out?" he asked briskly. "Don't try to talk. I'll tote you over by the wall away from the burners. Maybe we'll catch a little breeze from the windows there." She nodded weakly. He picked her up without too much trouble, carried her 3 yards or so to the wall, still isolated from the rest of the shop. She was ripely curved under that loose shirt, he learned. He set her down easily, crouching himself, and did not take his hands away. It's been a long time, he thought, and she was responding. Whether she knew it or not, there was a drowsy smile on her face, and her body moved a little against his hands, pleasurably. She was breathing harder. Ross did the sensible thing and kissed her. Wildcat! Ross reeled back from her fright and anger, his face copiously scratched. "I'm dreadfully sorry," he sputtered. "Please accept my sincerest—" The flare-up of rage ended. She was sobbing bitterly, leaning against the wall, wailing that nobody had ever treated her like that before, that she'd be set back 3 years if he told anyone, that she was a good, self-controlled girl, and he had no right to treat her that way, and what kind of degenerate was he, not yet 20 and going around kissing girls when everybody knew you went crazy from it. He soothed her from a distance. Her sobbing dropped to a bilious croon as she climbed the ladder to the yellow vat, tears still on her face, and checked its temperature. Ross, wondering if he were already crazy from too much kissing of girls, mechanically resumed his duties. But she had responded. And how long had they been working? And wasn't this shift ever going to end? All the shifts ended in time, but there was a catch to it. There was always another shift. After the afternoon shift on the dye vats came dinner, porridge, and then came the evening shift on the dye vats, and then sleep. The foreman was lenient, though. He let Ross off the vats after the end of the second day. Then it was kitchen orderly and only 2 shifts a day. And besides, he got plenty to eat. But it was a long, long way, Ross thought sardonically to himself, from the shining pictures he had painted to himself back on Halsey's planet. Ross the explorer, Ross the hero, Ross the savior of humanity, Ross the semi-permanent KP. He had to admit it to himself. The expedition thus far had been a bust. Not only was it perfectly clear that there no longer was a Franklin Foundation on Gemser, but more had been lost than time and effort. For Ross himself, he silently admitted, was as close to lost as he ever wanted to be. He was, in effect, a prisoner in a prison from which there was no easy escape as long as he was cursed with youthfulness. Of course, the implications of that were that there was a perfectly easy escape in time. All he had to do was get old enough to matter on this insane planet. 90, maybe. And then he would be perfectly free to totter out to the spaceport, dragoon a squad of juniors into lifting him into the ship, and take off. Helena was some help, but only psychologically. She was pleasant company, but neither she nor anyone else in the roster of 48 to whom he was permitted to speak had ever heard of the Franklin Foundation, or FTL travel, or anything. Helena said, "Wait for Holiday. Maybe one of the grown-ups will tell you then." Holiday? Ross slid back and scratched his shoulder blades against the corner of his bed. Helena was sprawled on the floor, half watching a projected picture on the screen at the end of the dormitory. "Yes, you're lucky. It's only 8 days off. That's when Doberman," she pointed to the foreman, "graduates. He's the only one this year. And we all move up a step. And the new classes come in, and then we'll get everything we want. Well, pretty near," she amended. "We can't do anything bad, but you'll see, it's nice." Then the picture ended, and it was calisthenics time, and then lights out. 48 men and women on their 48 bunks. The honor system appeared to work beautifully. There had been no sign of sex play that Ross had been able to see. Slept the sleep of the innocent. While Ross, the 49th, lay staring into the dark with rising hope. In the kitchen the next morning, he got more information from Helena. Holiday seemed to be a cross between Saturnalia and Boys' Week. For one day of the year, the elders slightly relaxed their grip on the reins. On that day alone, one could speak before being spoken to, interrupt one's elders, even leave the room without being excused. Whee! Ross thought sourly. But still. The foreman, Doberman, once you learned how to handle him, wasn't such a bad guy. Ross, studying his habits, learned the proper approach and used it. Doberman's commonest complaint was of irresponsibility. Irresponsibility when some 30-year-old junior was caught sneaking into line ahead of his proper place. Irresponsibility when Ross forgot to make his bed before stumbling out in the dark to his kitchen shift. One awful case of irresponsibility when Helena thoughtlessly poured cold water into the cooking vat while it was turned on. There was a sizzle, a crackle, and a puff of steam, and Helena was weeping over a broken heating element. Doberman came storming over, and Ross saw his chance. "That is very irresponsible of you, Helena," he said coldly, back to Doberman, but entirely conscious of his presence. "If Junior Unit 23 was all as irresponsible as you, it would reflect badly on Mr. Doberman. You don't know how lucky you are that Mr. Doberman is so kind to you." Helena's weeping dried up instantly. She gave Ross one furious glance and lowered her eyes before Doberman. Doberman nodded approvingly to Ross as he waded into Helena. It was a memorable tirade, but Ross only heard part of it. He was looking at the cooking vat. It was a simple-minded bit of construction, a spiral of resistance wire around a ceramic core. The core had cracked and one end of the wire was loose. If it could be reconnected, the cracked core shouldn't matter much. The wire was covered with insulation anyhow. He looked up and opened his mouth to say something, then remembered and merely stood looking brightly attentive. "Looks like you want to go back to the vats," the foreman was finishing. "Well, Helena, if that's what you want, we can make you happy. This time you'll be by yourself, too. You won't have Ross to help you out when the going's rough, will she, Ross?" "No, sir," Ross said immediately. "Sir?" Doberman looked back at him, frowning. "What?" "I think I can fix this," Ross said modestly. Doberman's eyes bulged. "Fix it?" "Yes, sir. It's only a loose wire. Back where I come from, we all learned how to take care of things like that when we were still in school. It's just a matter of—" "Now hold on, Ross," the foreman howled. "Tampering with a machine is bad enough. But if you're going to turn out to be a liar too, you're going just too far. School, indeed. You know perfectly well, Ross, that even I won't be ready for school until after holiday. Ross, I knew you were a troublemaker. Knew it the first day I set eyes on you. School. Well, we'll see how you like the school I'm going to send you to." The vats weren't so bad the second time, even though the porridge was cold for 2 days until somebody got around to delivering a different though equally worn-out cooking vat. Helena passed out from the heat 3 times. And when, on the 3rd time, Ross, goaded beyond endurance, kissed her again, there were no hysterics. End of chapter 5.